So tomorrow is May 9th, which is a big day in Russia. It's Victory Day, victory over Nazi Germany back in 1945. And every year it's celebrated profusely throughout Russia. It's a big day, a big holiday. It matters to them because so many people in the former Soviet Union died. What is it? Something like 26 million people died in that war. I mean, it's an enormous amount. 26 million, I think it was 18 million civilians and 8 million soldiers. I mean, think of the numbers. It's catastrophic. And so it's a big deal for the Russians. But what's interesting is American analysts, Western analysts. See, they have this habit that's really interesting. They claim, like way back in March, they were claiming that the Russians had to win by May 9th. They had to win in Ukraine, or else, they were losing. It's always this dichotomy. You've either won completely or you're losing. It's never, of course, the possibility that you're slowly winning. No, it's always dramatic, one or the other, Manichaean. Anyway, the analysts have been saying this, and of course, as we come closer to May 9th, and the war is still progressing here in Ukraine, they're saying, oh, the Russians are failing. They're failures. They're losers. The Russian army can't cut it because they haven't won in Ukraine by May 9th. You see? You see what they're doing? They create a goalpost. They set up a goalpost. And if the person that they're analyzing, the situation, the armed force, the country, whatever they're analyzing, doesn't reach that goalpost by the certain time that they have postulated, then they're losers and they're losing. And it gives them, the rationale to think that the other side is winning. Because, of course, if you're not winning, you're losing. And if you're losing, then the other side is winning. You see the weird mental gymnastics going on here? Yeah, it's been going on since the start of the war. Okay? The Russians, when they struck out into Kiev, the Kiev area, because altogether they had 6 axes of attack. And one of those axes, of course, was Kiev. And they put in something like 30 to 40,000 troops to go into Kiev. And of course, Kiev is an enormous city, 3 million people at the time. 3 million people, 100,000 defenders, Ukraine armed forces who were trained, supplied, equipped, all gassed up with all their tanks intact at the very start of the war, of course. And so with 30,000 troops, can you realistically expect to take a city of 3 million people with 100,000 defenders? Of course not. That's absurd. Standard military doctrine says that in order to capture a city, you have to go in with at least 3 times the number of defenders. That would mean that the Russians would need 300,000 troops at least to capture Kiev. But they went in with not 300,000, only 30,000. So obviously their aim is not to capture Kiev because they're not going in there. And of course they're not stupid. They know what they need in order to capture a city like Kiev. But they didn't go in there with that number of troops. But see, all of these American analysts, all of these people who are looking at the war with a bias that's so powerful that they are unable to see the reality of the situation, they set up the goalpost that, oh, the Russians have not captured Kiev, therefore they're losing. Therefore, Ukraine is winning. They didn't look at the situation and say to themselves, well, obviously the Russians aren't here to capture the city because they don't have enough troops, and that's pretty obvious. They only have 30,000 as opposed to the 300,000 that they would actually need at least to capture the city. And therefore, they must have some other objective with putting in 30,000 troops. What objective could that possibly be? If you're sensible, you realize that the objective was not to capture Kiev. It was to pin down those 100,000 troops that were defending Kiev, to make sure that those 100,000 troops didn't go anywhere. Because, of course, those 100,000 troops, if you're leading the Ukraine army, you don't want to pull them out, because if you pull them out, those 30,000 troops, few as they are, will capture your city of Kiev. So you have to keep those 100,000 there. And so they're pinned down. They can't go elsewhere to assist in some other battle in some other place in the country. You see? I mean, it was really obvious that that was the whole point of the Russians putting in 30,000 troops. They didn't mean to ever capture Kiev. There was never a battle of Kiev. That's the other funny thing. They keep talking about a battle of Kiev. There was no such battle. The Russians came in, and when they encountered resistance, they pulled back and adjusted and basically kept their distance from the Ukrainian armed force. Of course, there were some small arms fire, some little clashes, but it wasn't a big all-out battle for Kiev. It just pinned down those 100,000 troops. And when they were good and ready at the end of March, they pulled out. they pulled out. And what had happened to those 100,000 troops? Well, they were stuck in Kiev, as they still are. They don't have gasoline, so they can't really go anywhere. And so they're kind of like useless. And that was the point of what the Russians did. But see, these analysts, and this is the key point, they create a goalpost, an objective that the Russians are allegedly pursuing with no evidence whatsoever. And when the Russians fail to achieve this objective, the analysts say, oh, the Russians lost, therefore the Ukrainians are winning. Yay, Ukraine. But that's not what's happening. And what the pernicious part of this mental gymnastics is that, the Ukrainians keep winning in these circumstances where you're ascribing to the Russians fake objectives that are really in your own mind. And when they fail to achieve them, you ascribe a victory to your side, and your side has all these victories, and yet it's losing the war. Because that's the reality of the situation. Right now, Ukraine is losing the war, and it's catastrophic, and it's horrible. And the Ukrainian armed forces are being decimated. And I, for one, think that this is horrifying, and I think that the Zelensky regime should sue for peace, if only to save the lives of these young men, these soldiers. Nobody's questioning their bravery. Nobody, certainly not me, but the needless loss of life for no reason whatsoever. This is a disaster for Ukraine. And not just because of this war, for the future of the Ukraine nation. These young men who are being killed because of this false notion that Ukraine is winning. All of these young men are the future of the country. Every single one of them who dies, it's one less Ukraine family. It's 2 or 3 fewer Ukrainian children. It's a disaster for the nation. And yet what's going on is that so many people are continuing with this pointless war because of this false notion that they're winning when they're not. You see how pernicious this kind of mental gymnastics is? You see how dangerous these analysts who lie, basically, or perhaps they're not lying, perhaps they're not even realizing that they're lying, but they're telling fairy tales to soothe themselves and soothe others, and worse yet, give the rationale to continue in a war that cannot be won. This is a disaster, and I every time I look at the video of young men killed in combat, it just breaks my heart. It just completely shatters me, because the future of Ukraine is dying because of this fiction